There's a war on, and not enough people know it. I'm not talking about the Third World War warming up nicely between Russia and the West over the weeping sore that is Ukraine, but the silent war waged by Parliament against we the people. It's not just between us Brits and our Parliament. Similar wars are being waged elsewhere in the West by governments against those they seek to govern, or rather to dominate. But the war being waged here against us in these islands may be the most important. Here in Britain, they like to tell us we have the mother of parliaments. It's hardly true, but it's a good line for the tourists. But if our Parliament wins this war, it will have consequences for the whole of the West and the whole of the world. Those aware of the silent war know it's been going on for many years. Some learned souls will tell you it's been the stuff of decades, if not centuries, passed between generations of politicians and others. The strategic objective is total control of the people. This is being achieved not by bullets and bombs, but by stealth, sleight of hand and the misuse of legislation. Those in pursuit of centralised power, of a one-world government, hate, and with every fibre of their being, sovereign nation-states. That said, they reserve a special loathing for national constitutions that define the rights of people in perpetuity. Total control of the sort the state has in mind requires the hoodwinking of the people into thinking Parliament is the highest power in the land, that they tell us what to do. It's interesting to note that hoodwinking is a term from the art of falconry, whereby a falcon with lethal talons, the swiftest attacking flight and the sharpest eyesight of all living creatures, is kept docile and under control simply by having a little hood placed over its head. I called it a silent war, and I mean it. Do you hear the dissenting voices? Can you hear the rage? No, that's because you're not meant to. For those involved, it feels like most people in the country are behind soundproof glass. No matter how loud the drumming with fists on that glass, too many carry on regardless. Feels like a bad dream in which disaster is looming in the form of a giant wave or a wall of flame, and yet no one hears the alarm being raised. Now we're in the end game of this war, and fortunately for us, right in the closing stages, over these last 2 years or so, Parliament and those who would control our Parliament finally overplayed their hand, and by the high-handed application of disastrous and draconian policies inadvertently woke too many people up to the ruse that's being played on them. It's as though after all those years of distance run, the last bunch handed the baton of the relay race for the sprint to the finish line have proven to be the clumsiest clowns, tripping over their own feet. So much power seized so quickly went to their heads. But for all that, we have to concede that they tried their damnedest to get over the line, and are definitely still trying. For these last 2 or 3 years, the underdogs caught up in the silent war have literally been silenced, forced to shut up. I've always considered myself to be about as mild-mannered as they come, obedient to rules, respectful of authority. If you told me a few years ago that I'd be censored here in the UK for asking questions, I'd have scoffed. But here we are, and here I am, like so many others, increasingly subject to censorship online. Too many broadcasters and journalists in this country, those inclined to speak up about blatant wrongs by authority, have simply been silenced, and far too many have been willingly and enthusiastically complicit in the slavish transmission of Parliament's message and the suppression of contrary views. And yet, 3 years later, and all manner of silenced views, those that were called misinformation or ridiculed as conspiracy theory have been proven correct after all. Scientists, doctors and other health professionals, a handful of journalists, people from all walks of life had their reputations trashed, their livelihoods destroyed, and yet they were right all along. But still the censorship and silencing goes on. Bill Gates, the self-appointed Lord God Almighty of science and vaccines, has himself come out and admitted the so-called vaccines he pushed on everyone don't work as advertised. But if I quote him on some online channels, that content comes down. The so-called vaccines are being withdrawn for the under-50s, and yet to ask why, when those products are still described only as safe and effective, is to invite yet more silencing. Last week we learned, like it was any kind of surprise, that the government had deployed spies and sneaks to record dissenting voices and seek to have their voices silenced. Among them, the 77th Brigade, a PSYOPs unit of the British Army that uses social media to help the government control the narrative and push its propaganda. MP Tobias Ellwood, chairman of the Defence Select Committee, and in my opinion a spy master and warmonger, is the brigade's lieutenant colonel. Around the world it's the same. Outspoken Canadian psychologist Dr Jordan Peterson has been threatened with the removal of his licence to practice unless he submits to, quote, social media re-education. In other words, stop saying what you're saying or there will be consequences. In this war, silence is the principal weapon. It's ruthlessly wielded by Parliament and its lackeys. Worse by far, though, is to silence yourself. Once the silence is accepted as the safest way, the only way, then the war is over. Now is the time to make noise, a lot of noise. Make no mistake, this is the end game. All of their weapons are in plain view. Digital IDs are almost with us. The framework of central bank digital currencies is already here. Surveillance cameras are everywhere, even in our phones and on the screens we carry every day. 15-minute cities are the new lockdown, the new ghettos. Everywhere they're proposed, they're opposed by the majority of the people. And what happens? The councils have the audacity to ride roughshod over supposed democracy and impose them anyway, expressly against the wishes of the people. None of us voted for any of this Agenda 2030 nonsense. And does that matter? Not as far as the so-called leaders are concerned. They just do it anyway. And always it's the so-called climate crisis, the greatest hoax of modern times. That's the stick being used to beat us. The justification for making us poorer, colder, hungrier, restricted in every way and monitored 24 hours a day. With all this ranged against us, what can we do? For a start, we can speak out, learn the power of no to all of it, march and protest before they pass legislation making that illegal as well. But our principal weapon, in many ways the only weapon we need, is right here under our noses. Believe it or believe it not, scoff if you will, but it's our national constitution. Given that we are a constitutional monarchy, and in May we are to watch crowned our new constitutional monarch in the form of King Charles III, right now is the perfect time to remember and be re-educated about what our constitution says and means. To cut to the chase, it exposes the lie, the blatant lie that Parliament is sovereign. Our constitution makes plain that Parliament is not and never can be sovereign. Our constitution is older than Parliament, came before there was such a thing as Parliament, and so no Parliament can alter it, far less ignore it. Parliament is bound by the Constitution and yet cannot touch it. This fact alone must drive the would-be tyrants and despots in Westminster up the wall with centuries of frustration. Only we the people are sovereign. Only we the people have the final say, the absolutely final say on our governance. If you won't take my word for it, how about that of John Adams, founding father and second president of the United States? Quote, should it be argued that a government like this, where the sovereignty resides in the whole body of the people, is a democracy, it may be answered that the right of the sovereignty in all nations is unalienable and indivisible and does and can reside nowhere else. Most importantly of all, even though the vast majority of people have deliberately been made unaware of this crucial fact, is that only we the people have the power to judge the justice of the laws we choose to live by. This is not some obscure legal talk. This is simple, fundamental, and, which is most important of all, true. It should be on T-shirts and badges. Every child should be taught this above all. Any government that empowers itself to write legislation and also to impose the punishment for breaching that legislation is a tyranny. Any people that submits to the idea that the government both makes the legislation and enforces it is a people living under a dictatorship. This power, this absolute power of the people, is wielded via the jury. Generations of people in this country have been miseducated into overlooking this power. But the undeniable fact is that every jury has the power to judge the very justice of the law. When a jury hears a trial, even if it's proven beyond doubt that legislation, a law, has been broken, the jury may still set the accused free. Indeed, if trial by jury is being exercised as defined by the Constitution, even one juror finding the accused not guilty must result in a not guilty verdict. If you listen to this and think the power of the jury is awesome, that is because it truly is. And that's why we must never allow any here today and gone tomorrow government to try and persuade us otherwise. Every day that passes when we allow our government and our judiciary to blind us to that awesome truth is another day closer to abject tyranny and to the rule of despots. I mentioned King Charles. If we do in fact live still in a constitutional monarchy, then the constitutional monarch must swear an oath to protect the rights of the people, not the rights of Parliament, not of the government, but the people against all comers. For more than 1,000 years, our constitutional monarchs, Queen Elizabeth II included, have sworn also to protect our national borders. Our democracy is founded upon the unquestioned, unchallenged sovereignty of the people. The The monarch swears to protect our liberties without exception. If anyone tells you that our Constitution, founded upon Magna Carta 1215, has been set aside or superseded, is simply and profoundly wrong. Here's the thing, and here's how we win the war. Either we live in a democracy in the form of a constitutional monarchy, or we don't. If we don't, then Parliament better at least have the decency to tell us so, and furthermore to explain when and how that happened. We are free people and sovereign. We're not granted that freedom by Parliament, but by the bedrock of our Constitution, indeed by the universe itself. That Constitution is much older than Magna Carta, which was only a 1215 restatement of what was already true and understood and made real by the much older common law. I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it until the silence is overwhelmed and we begin the long task of remembering that we cannot be told what to do by government. That truth is final and can only be denied by those who either don't know it or who do know it and are lying.